Hello, welcome to MOOC on Public Policy. I am Dr. Shaji, Faculty of Political Science, University of Hyderabad. Today I'm going to speak on India's foreign policy approaches and trajectories. Basically, this particular module is made to familiarize you with major approaches and the trajectory on which Indian foreign policy has traversed in the last 70 years. It's basically an attempt to give you an overview of these approaches and the trajectories. So in the first part of the presentation, I will be speaking on the approaches to understand Indian foreign policy. There are basically 5 important approaches by which one can look at Indian foreign policy. Before speaking on India's the various approaches to foreign policy, I would like to give an idea about the significance of India in its geographic region, that is South Asia. India is the largest state in South Asia. It constitutes 74% of the total population of the region. It's a nuclear power. Along with Pakistan, it constitutes around 75% of GDP of the region, and it of course receives 79%, which is like more than 3/4 of the total foreign direct investment that flows into the region. And there is overall an India-centric nature in the region in terms of its language, ethnicity, religion, and so on. So now coming back to the foreign policy, in general, the foreign policy implies a set of principles, regulations, and rules by which an independent state conducts its relations with the rest of the world. As far as India's foreign policy is concerned, there are certain approaches by which we can study or examine the relations that India has been involved in historically and also in the contemporary times. The approaches to India's foreign policy broadly comprises of preservation of sovereignty, alliance pressures, power distributions, conflict over political values, domestic politics, and so on and so forth. Preservation of sovereignty is an important approach in the sense that Indian foreign policy is preoccupied with the notion of territoriality, nationalism, and autonomy. In fact, these ideas were quite significant from the very beginning of India's foreign policy, in the sense that the foreign policy was getting approach on sovereignty implies that there are certain issues which are very significant for Indian foreign policy. They are territoriality, nationalism, and autonomy and freedom of choice. In fact, a country like India was quite obsessed with these ideas from the very beginning, in the sense that from the time when foreign policy was conceptualized broadly by India's national leadership, which in fact started much before India's independence. To a large extent, this particular preoccupation with the idea of sovereignty came from India's own historical experience. For instance, the national movement's concerns and obsessions with the ideas of nationalism, anti-colonialism, anti-racialism, and so on and so forth. To a large extent, this shaped India's foreign policy in the pre-independent period. Though India was not a state, an independent state as such, but it was a quasi-legal entity. And subsequently, in the post-independent period, the notion of sovereignty has led India to take up a position on non-alignment. And subsequently, the ideas of sovereignty formed the very core of foreign policy debates even in the post-Cold War period. Another important approach is alliance pressures. Indian foreign policy can be understood in terms of alliances that has been built by India's neighbors, for instance, and mainly three important powers, India's neighbors such as China and Pakistan, and also United States from outside the region. So the foreign policy was concerned about the alliances that the neighbors have built or they have entered into. So the study would always look at the structuring of these alliances and the alliances that India has built in order to counter the alliances of its adverse powers. And coming back to the approaches, the third one is power distribution. It talks about how power is actually distributed in international system. For instance, in the Cold War period, how Cold War binaries created a particular structure and to which how India reacted to. Similarly, in the post-Cold War period, how the power distribution changed in terms of the new international order and how India structured its policies towards it. And as far as the fourth approach is concerned, it is about the conflict over political values. There are certain political values which always shape the foreign policy discourses. These are based on certain normative understanding of world politics along with the ideational aspects of the leadership. For instance, in the pre-independent period, the ideas of non-violence, anti-racialism, anti-colonialism shaped India's perspectives on foreign policy. And similarly, in the post-independent period, the notions on ideas of, for instance, how, as far as the fourth approach of foreign policy studies is concerned, it is conflict over political ideas. In this particular context, one has to look at how certain normative understanding of world politics along with ideational dimensions of Indian leadership have contributed to the shaping of foreign policy at different points in time. For instance, during the pre-independent period, it was ideas such as non-violence, anti-racialism, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism contributed to the thinking about India's foreign relations. In the post-independent period, more or less same ideas have contributed to the shaping of the foreign policy, which eventually led to the structuring of a policy called non-alignment. And based on these normative ideas, India have shaped its visions or perspectives on issues such as disarmament, solidarity with the third world countries, and so on and so forth. To a large extent, the shift in normative ideas which formed the base of the foreign policy in the post-Cold War period would give us a certain kind of tools to understand how India's position on disarmament changed in the post-Cold War period in terms of its policy on, say, nuclearization and so on and so forth. Another important approach is domestic politics. The last important approach by which Indian foreign policy can be examined is domestic politics. It is often stated that foreign policy is an extension of the domestic politics. In that sense, how domestically structured political realities are linked with foreign policy forms the core of this particular approach. For instance, the the via media position that Indian politics used to take, especially during the Cold War period, was the base by which India took a via media position in international relations, in the international arena, by way of the policy of non-alignment. So broadly, these are the 5 important approaches: the preservation of sovereignty, alliance pressure, power distributions, conflict over political values, and domestic politics. So one can look at the foreign policy through either of these important approaches, or maybe a combination of some of these. So in this section, we have broadly looked at major approaches through which one can look at and examine India's foreign policy. So sovereignty broadly talks about autonomy and freedom of choice. Alliance pressure talks about how alliances are built and entered into by India's major adverse powers, and to which how India react to. And the third important approach is power distribution, in which how power is generally distributed in international system and how Indian foreign policy is responding to. And the fourth important approach that we have talked about is conflict over political ideas, how certain kind of ideas have been shaping Indian foreign policy, and how those kind of ideas, those ideas are actually getting into the foreign policy making. The last approach that we talked about was domestic politics, which broadly gave us an idea about how domestic structuring of the internal politics of India has influenced on foreign policy making.